Okay, thanks, Julius. Some introduction and background to the topic this evening, and I'll be introducing our speakers as well. I want to talk a little bit about how this topic came to be. As many of you know, if you're adoption triad members or work in the field, adoption and abortion often come up in the same breath or come up with comments sometimes that can kind of hit people between the eyes. It's a highly emotional topic, and a lot of times people say comments that might or might not land in the same space that you're in. This came up specifically almost a year ago. We had Damon Davis with us, who's again with us this evening on tonight's panel. And Damon, who's a podcaster, and his podcast is called Who Am I Really? Damon was talking to us about the lessons learned that he had learned since he started his podcast after interviewing 150 or 200 adoptees. And interestingly, one of them was about adoption and abortion and how often people conflate those, but how different they are. And it got a huge audience reaction. It was obviously something that needed to be explored more and that people wanted to talk about more. And so that was kind of when this conversation for tonight started to take form a little bit. Lorene Harbert, who's the moderator for tonight's panel, emailed me right after that session and said, let's organize something. And so we've met a few times since then and been putting this evening together. I want to make clear that we're not here to take a stand on abortion, its morality or its legality. The point is not to call out or discuss being pro-life or pro-choice. We ask that everybody refrain from making any of your questions or discussion political. We're really here to talk about the juxtaposition of abortion and adoption and how those are seen, and hopefully to expand people's horizons with that discussion. Our goals this evening are to take a look at the way that abortion and adoption are commonly conflated, to look at the impact this conflation has on those who are touched by adoption and the effect that it has on people's discourse and understanding of these two paths. One of the things we talked about in our planning that I thought was really helpful was about mirrors, doors, and windows, which is a concept coming from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, originally relating to children's literature, but it can be useful here too, that sometimes you hear things and you see something that helps you to reinforce something that you already believe or see something within yourself that's familiar. Other times you're hearing a message that might be a window to how other people think, or even a door into stepping into a different way of thinking. And so I thought that was a helpful analogy for this evening, and that I would really encourage people to listen through that lens and frame how you listen that way. So some of what you hear this evening might validate beliefs that you already have or thoughts that you already have. Some of the things that you hear might help you stretch, and we ask that everybody keep an open mind. So with that, I've got the pleasure of introducing our panel. Lorene Harbert is mom to an 11-year-old boy adopted as a newborn in Ohio. She and her husband have since moved out of state, but she's stayed involved with the Adoption Network over the years. Both her professional and volunteer work have focused on issues of reproductive justice and sexual health and education, including pregnancy options, counseling, abortion care, HIV prevention and care, and adoption education. She has authored numerous medical education and patient education resources and is a co-author of the 2005 edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. I've known Lorene for a long time, and I didn't know that until I saw it in your bio. Lorene loves listening to people's life stories, reading memoirs, and being in the community and connecting with people. She lives in Minneapolis with her husband, her son, and her dog. And we have Liz Moriarty. Liz received a crash course in what open adoption means when she made an adoption plan after an unexpected pregnancy. Since then, she has spoken openly about her adoption experience and how modern adoption looks in order to change society's perception, reduce stigma, and educate others about open adoption. Liz serves on the board of Bellis, which is in Minnesota, and she's going to post a little bit more about what that is, and is an early childhood special education teacher. Liz lives with her husband and her two children that they are parenting together, and is a birth mother in an open adoption since 2004. And we have Damon Davis. Damon is an adoptee who was reunited with his biological mother in 2009, and a heartwarming story of coincidental history and a mutual desire to be reunified. He's a storyteller at heart who enjoys hearing and sharing the real stories of our lives that makes each of us who we are. He created the podcast, Who Am I Really?, to help people placed into adoption or who grew up in foster care to explore their own emotions, desires, and questions about reuniting with their biological family by asking others to share their true stories. Damon has also written a memoir by that same name that was published in 2019. You can find out more about him on his website, which is whoamireallypodcast.com. And with that, I welcome everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to share a quick quote that kind of grounds this conversation. Betsy shared that, we had been talking about this conversation, since last summer, and, things got busy. And then after the oral arguments for an abortion case involving a law in Mississippi was argued at the Supreme Court in early December, it just brought this issue front and center. It was sort of in the the national spotlight for a couple of days, because Justice Amy Coney Barrett did exactly what we were talking about in terms of conflating adoption and abortion. And during the course of questioning one of the lawyers involved in the case, she said, "So it seems to me, seen in that light, both Roe and Casey, the 1992 case that upheld the right to abortion, emphasized the burdens of parenting and the obligations of motherhood that flow from pregnancy. Why don't safe haven laws take care of that problem?" So safe haven laws are the option for a newborn to be dropped off in a safe place, a hospital or a police station, so that with the hopes that that would lower the incidence of newborns being abandoned in unsafe circumstances that might lead to their harm or death. So again, in that very public sphere, we see that conflation of, well, if we have this other option, why is abortion, necessary in a sense? And then to counter that, there was a lot of conversation around that, and this is sort of an interesting quote from, from a sociologist who was involved in a study that looked at women who were seeking abortions but were turned away because of they were too far along in their pregnancies to be seen by the provider that they went to for those abortion services. And so they studied those women who were turned away to see how, how things followed for them after that experience of not being able to obtain an abortion. And one of, so this refers to that, research that was done. She says, "I have encountered almost no women that are choosing between those two things, abortion and adoption, and weighing one against the other. Among the women who were turned away from accessing abortions that they wanted, over 90% of them chose to parent." So I think that's a good way to sort of ground this conversation and let us see some of the ways in which this conflation of abortion and adoption plays out in public discourse. And as we were preparing for this conversation, we really, started thinking about, what are the realms in which conflation of adoption and abortion have a real impact for people. And we'll get to that in a second. I did just want to invite the panelists, though, to share their entree point to this topic of adoption and abortion being conflated, because we all come at this from, different perspectives, and we thought it would be helpful to just sort of introduce our interest and experience about this topic. So Damon, do you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to do this too, because I think this is an important thing for us to distinguish and to sort of have a discourse about. So many years ago, I started this podcast, Who Am I Really? And I was new to all of the lingo and the concepts surrounding adoption. I'm coming off of reunion with my own biological mother. I'm coming off of this realization that my son is the first biological relative I've ever known. I'm entering Facebook groups and the Twitter sphere and Reddit and all kinds of places where adoptees are speaking about their adoption experiences, their reunion attempts, and all of these things. And I'm in there trying to be supportive and, looking for folks who are interested in talking about adoption more so that I can try to find guests for my show. And as I'm in these forums, I was on Facebook one evening and someone said something along the lines of, and this was not a comment to me. This was a comment from one Facebook participant to another who had made a post. And the respondent basically said, you should be glad that you weren't aborted. And I agreed with that statement in support. I just said, I agree with so-and-so that we are very lucky for the lives that we lead, or something along those lines. And I made this comment in support of, you should be lucky that you weren't aborted. And I was thankful that on the side, I got a direct message from someone. Her name was Rebecca, and Rebecca sent me a direct message. And she said, listen, Damon, we don't talk about adoption and abortion in the same breath. And she went on to explain to me that they're not two sides of the same coin. They're two completely different coins. The first is, I'm pregnant. Am I going to carry this child to term, or am I not? The second coin entirely comes off of that decision tree, which is, if I've decided to carry this child to term, will I be the child's parent, or will someone else be the child's parent? And when she described that to me, it really struck me that she was absolutely right. There were two completely different elements to what it takes for a parent to bring a child into the world. There's the decision about where they are in their pregnancy and whether they are actually going to make sure that this child comes into the world, and then after that decision is made, will I be this child's parent, or is the child going to be parented by someone else? And it really struck me. I thought really long and hard about it. And so I've taken it upon myself now, when I see that kind of commentary in a Facebook post or somewhere like that, I then am the whisperer in the background who will send a message to someone and say, hey, listen, I wanted you to know. And sometimes I'll say it publicly, like not directly to the respondent, but just in the group so that all can see that this is the way we like to talk about this, because they shouldn't be conflated. And it was just a really enlightening moment for me. And it's, obviously one of many that I've experienced as someone who's talked to hundreds of people about adoption. So that's kind of where I came into this space.
Thanks, Damon. That's super helpful. And Liz?
Yeah, I feel like that is actually the perfect entree point too, for my perspective, especially because that piece where the decision isn't always about abortion, the decision is really, when you choose adoption as a birth mother, it's whether or not you're going to parent. And when people assume whatever my view might be, or if they just make an assumption that I'm pro-life because I chose adoption for one of my children, it simplifies such a nuanced decision into just the perspective and the piece of it that wasn't even the hardest part for me. And so I think that we're really doing a huge disservice too when we talk about adoption and abortion in that same breath, like Damon was just saying, that we're taking away all of the nuance of the decision and why they can't be conflated, because it's so much bigger choosing adoption than it is whether or not you chose an abortion.
I come at this conversation actually from years of working in pregnancy option counseling and abortion care. And I was always very focused on the way that people conflated unplanned pregnancies and abortion. So we would hear this sort of commentary about we want abortions to be safe but rare. And I was, really tuned into that, saying, well, the abortion is not the so-called problem. Like, that's not the thing we want to have be rare necessarily. We want to prevent unplanned or mistimed pregnancies. And then, you're kind of addressing the root challenge or the root problem. So it's interesting to me that conflation was so present for me in that context, working in that field. And then as, we started exploring adoption personally, I remember sitting in a room with, actually it was the Rocky River support group meeting of Adoption Network Cleveland. And one of the first times I really had conversations with birth mothers, and I was just astonished by the language that this one particular birth mother was talking around the shame and the stigma that she felt having been a birth mother and making that choice, and the judgment that came directed towards her and that she felt towards herself. And I was really astonished because I had always heard that language directed at people who chose abortion, and had always heard about adoption being, quote unquote, the loving choice, or, kind of the heroic way to manage a pregnancy that came at the wrong time. And so that was a real eye-opening moment for me. And it sort of helped me distinguish here, like that, maybe talking about abortion and adoption as, two sides of the same coin, was really missing the mark. If in both cases, the people experiencing those choices are feeling these similar experiences from what they're hearing in public discord. And I do think that we still do talk in terms of pregnancy options. We still talk about, you have three options of parenting, terminating the pregnancy through abortion, or making an adoption plan. And so I think that this conflation continues to happen. It's sort of the way we talk about pregnancy options reinforces that. So anyway, it was fun in our conversations to kind of sort, that was sort of an eye-opening moment for me, that I realized I had this other path in which it was so clear to me about the way we conflate things, but I had been blind to this piece. So in any case, let's get into some of what we talked about in our preliminary conversations. Certainly the quote by Justice Barrett highlights one of the areas in which the conflation of adoption and abortion has a real impact, and that is in the public policy sphere. And so when we talk about adoption and abortion in a public policy sphere as two sides of the same coin, one of the outcomes of that is to sort of set up a marketplace mentality, where, for instance, some policy makers feel like, one of the reasons we might restrict abortion is that there are so many families waiting for an adoption, the possibility of an adoption, and are interested in adoption, and they, are waiting and waiting for a child to be placed for adoption. And so that does, set up this scenario where you're sort of saying one, adoption and abortion are related in this kind of marketplace mentality, and we are interested in sort of discussing how that plays out, and why the conflation of abortion and adoption in this way that sets up this marketplace scenario, what the impacts of that are.
Let me jump in there real quick. One of the things that comes to mind for me is the idea that in any marketplace, to be correct, I mean, this is real. You've got something to sell, right? You have a product, and the children who are in need of adoption are not products that need to be passed from a producer to a buyer to use marketplace terms. And so what it creates in my mind is a commoditization of the child as a component of the marketplace, the item that is moving from one producer, as it were, to the quote unquote buyer. And that's a horrible mentality to have, because if anybody knows anything about a marketplace, there's supply and demand issues, and they are frequently at odds with each other. And when one is up, the other is down, and vice versa. And to use marketplace terms, the price goes up and things like that. And listen, we're talking about human lives. This is not the place to be talking in terms of commodities. And I think we have to this is part of the education that needs to happen. The same way that you talked, Laureen, about the 3 options for pregnancy, it's 2 options, and then the next 2 options. The same thing has to happen for the discussion of what's required in adoption. We should not be pressing birth mothers to produce their children because there's a recipient on the other end that's waiting to receive their child. That's wrong. And it also creates a bit of this like heroism that is associated with adoption, where we feel like we're trying to take this child and move it into this better place. And so we have to be really, really careful about the commodity discussion that we sometimes hear people having, because it's not appropriate for this discussion of human lives. And Liz, I'd love to hear what your piece is of this.
I know there's 0 aspect of that sits well with me when we talk about people as commodities. None of that, right? Like, we know that this is not how we want it at all to view it. And I do think that human aspect is always taken out of it. And especially when I was listening to you talk about it the other day, the first thing that came to my mind too, as you were starting to go through it, it was like, well, if, right? Like when we talk about policymakers or the idea of the marketplace, if the babies are the commodities, then what does that make the birth mother? The supplier? Like but that's not, it's just the entire thing just feels gross and awful. And I really wish that human aspect of it could be brought into it more often. And I don't think it ever really is until you start to break it down. And then I think it was Betsy who was like, yeah, you guys are, you could see it as like an unpaid labor. Like, it's gross. There's no aspect of it that works well. And until you hear someone break it down, you just don't even stop to think of it that way.
Laureen, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I remember so distinctly. I was when we were pursuing our adoption, I had a coworker who was also an adoptive mom, and like we were in the restroom together washing our hands or something, and she was saying sort of privately to me, knowing that we were pursuing an adoption, and she was like, oh gosh, we were just waiting, and I was so like, here are all these women having abortions, and we're just waiting for this baby. And I think similar to you, Liz, sort of sometimes the assumption is that because you made an adoption plan, you're opposed in some way to abortion. I think she was making that connection with, like, she was trying to connect with me on the topic of, isn't it terrible that women are choosing abortion? And I was kind of taken aback by it, and sort of landed exactly where you are, Liz, with, like, my inability to get pregnant and my, wanting to grow my family through adoption doesn't require, I'm not requiring someone else to, like, be the supplier of a baby for me. Like, that's independent. Like, the women making that choice are independent of my situation and my desire to grow my family through adoption.
It sounds like there's another coin in there almost. It's the, if I'm not going to adopt, if I'm going to give birth to the child and the child is not going to be parented by me, will there be an adoption plan? And so there's this coin of, like, will the child go into, a family or through an adoption, or unfortunately, like, there's foster care and other, like, there's a whole other coin over here. And I'm not necessarily going to get the analogy right, but you understand what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah,
there's several decision trees there where once you've made this decision, now you have a whole new set of decisions. And once you've made the
right.
next one, there's a whole new set, and they don't just all flow naturally together.
And I think, yeah, I mean, I think truly in her mind, it was like, well, if these pregnant people were not choosing abortion, then their babies would be available to you, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that came up in our conversation is, we talk about policymakers and how even the three of us in our journeys and personal life experiences had this sort of growth in our understanding of, the way that adoption and abortion intersect. I get really nervous when policymakers who do have some experience with adoption in some way, maybe would be deferred to. Like, for instance, Justice Barrett is an adoptive mom. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, don't let her speak for all. I hope people are not, sort of deferring and letting her speak for adoptive moms or represent adoptive moms. Because, my understanding of abortion and adoption and their relationship, is not in line with her understanding as she presented it during those questions.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because you've got this public figure who is seen as an adoptive mother and is deferred to by people who are outside of the adoption sort of constellation. We'll just call them lay folks for now, because I don't have a better word for it. But you've got the lay public and then the people inside the adoption constellation. And because she is inside the constellation, her opinion is valued highly, especially as a public figure, but her opinion is not expressing sort of the reality of the entire situation. She still comes from a certain lens as an adoptive parent, and her particular opinions didn't necessarily reflect everybody else's input. And so we do have to be careful about who we put up on the pedestal as experts on something like adoption and all of the policies that coincide with it, because what ends up happening is potentially a dangerous misallocation of resources, be they funds, attention to the issues. She's in a place where she can, call people to testify, for example. And if you're coming from a certain lens, you could call some of the wrong folks, or folks who are going to be sort of misaligned with, they're going to be aligned with traditional mentality and misaligned with sort of a new thinking about what adoption could be. It can be really dangerous. And especially I want to hit on the resource allocation piece, because the policymakers are the ones who are able to stand up sort of the infrastructure for how things get funded. And if the resources are going in the wrong places, supporting more adoptions as if it's an engine that needs fuel versus, for example, if an infant is born into a family and if the grandmother could be given another $100 a month to get a slightly larger apartment and $50 for food, and that child could stay in the family. The investment of resources into her home keeps the child in the family and reduces the mental anguish on that child of not knowing who they are as it applies to their life. It reduces the mental anguish of the family having lost track of that child as it has gone off into adoption. My point in raising this particular analogy is the resource allocation into what some would consider to be the wrong places has really dire effects going down the line as it applies to adoptees like myself, to birth mothers, to adoptive parents. We have to be very careful about being intentional with our policy discussion because it can really go awry and mess some things up pretty badly.
It's those moments when you just want to like shake up the entire system and like just start over, right? Like
Right.
we know that there are so many different outcomes we could have for children in general too, if we just really looked at some resource and allocation funding too. So, but I do think another important piece to note too, a little bit of what you both were just touching on is as we are all up here speaking from the birth mother perspective, the adoptee perspective, and the adoptive parent perspective, we are one perspective of each of those pieces, right? So you could go and speak to another birth mother, you could speak to another adoptee, you could speak to another adoptive parent, and you're going to get another perspective on this entire topic. So while I think it's really important to hear what we're each saying in our conversation, I think it's also important to continue the conversation later on in your smaller circles too.
Yeah, I agree. You got to get a breadth of perspectives. I agree 100%.
Yeah. Well, that kind of helps us to broaden out. So we've spent some time talking about the policy implications of this. If we just take a step back and just think about, you know, in general, the societal implications and the narratives and sort of what we, you know, find ourselves, the assumptions that are made about adoption and abortion and the people involved in that, you know, is impacted as well if we think about adoption and abortion as two sides of the same coin. And Liz, I know you have some strong feelings about this or some, you know, personal experience that has played out for you in terms of that very issue.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite in quotes, right? Like parts of this topic and this conversation is I like to shake things up a little bit. And for sure, I've noticed over the years, I do not look like what people would think is like a birth mother, right? Or that I chose adoption for an unplanned pregnancy. That in and of itself, as the stigmas and the stereotypes have gotten disruptive, it's a little bit less shocking, but it still is really shocking to people when they find out that piece about me. But the part that really gets me stuck sometimes and people stuck as well is if I say that I chose adoption, that's when it becomes the thing of like, oh, you were so selfless. Like you did such an amazing thing. You gave a child a home. You made the loving decision. But if I were to put it in the words of I purposefully made the decision not to parent at that time in my life, or even just I made the decision not to parent, I get looked at entirely differently because that goes against everything that we say that mothers that should do, except sometimes that is the most loving choice you can make, is to know whether or not it is the right time for you to parent and where those resources could be and the place for your child. So yeah, I think just thinking of it in the dichotomy of, and that false dichotomy, right? Of like, I chose adoption over abortion, or I chose adoption. I mean, that's the only one, right? Like if I say I chose adoption, like you automatically think I chose adoption over abortion. Nobody thinks that I chose adoption over choosing not to parent and really thinking about where I was in life at that time.
Yeah, I like the way you've phrased that because it immediately underscores your thought process. And to go back to something I was saying earlier, adoption generally in the lay public has a feeling of heroism, right? And you can think of all of your classic adoption stories from, you know, Annie and Webster, and I forgot what the other guy's name was with those little brothers who were adopted in New York. But the TV shows and things like that, there's all of these stories that make it seem like this child was taken from these awful adverse conditions and placed up on a pedestal in the ivory tower, and things have been awesome. And even in what you said, Liz, I could sense that when you moved the conversation from you were so brave to do that to I made the choice not to parent at this time, I could immediately feel the person on the other side of your conversation vilifying you for the way that you're actually thinking about it. And it's a similar vilification, I believe, of what happens with the folks, for anybody who makes that adoption and that abortion decision versus giving birth, and then the adoption decision versus parenting. And so there's a significant heroism associated with adoption that I think is incredibly challenging for us to overcome. There's a real strong overcurrent of, you know, adoption has some real rescuers in it. And this is dangerous for the policy discussion as well, because the policymakers can feel like they're heroes allocating resources and making points about how things should go when they're not necessarily accurate for what's best for the child. And I saw a comment in the chat that Lori brought up, which is, are we trying to find homes for babies, or are we trying to find babies for homes? And that's an important sort of thing to think really strongly about as it applies to sort of what your experience was, Liz, and what we adoptees end up going through. So there's a lot to think about there. This is not an easy topic, but I think the heroism is incredibly dangerous because it makes people feel awesome that they took this child that was in need and placed them over here. And you haven't actually thought, like, what could I have just tweaked over here that may have made so many things much better? This is really difficult stuff.
Yeah, and I think as an adoptive parent, you know, it's not uncommon for people to say, oh, you know, your son is so lucky that he landed in your family. And, you know, obviously I feel lucky. And when we were having our prep meeting, Damon and Betsy also were sharing kind of the flip side for the adoptee around this, oh, that child is so lucky to have landed in this family. Maybe, Damon, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. There's also sort of significant guilt as the adoptee, right? Like, you feel like you should feel lucky to be wherever you are. And, you know, I'm going into my 10th season of this show, and I can tell you there have been so many people that have said, I would love to have known what life would have been like had I been in my other family. But they feel guilty saying that because there's this societal pressure to feel so grateful for everything that did happen for them. Now, I'm not saying many adoptees are not grateful. I'm saying that the pressure to be grateful is inappropriate, especially for a layperson who is not part of the constellation. It's really challenging. And this sort of plays off of the heroism thing too. If we have played hero to rescue you from whatever situation you were in, you should be grateful for wherever it is that you are, and basically keep your mouth shut. Don't bother searching for any biological parents or whatever the other desires that you might have to know more about yourself it's required of you to suppress them. And this is part of why I think adoptees don't necessarily go about search as early as they might want to, because there's this guilt impressed upon us about how lucky we should feel.
Gosh, I feel like the three of us could talk about this all night, but I love the chats and the like sort of reflections that our comments have brought up from the rest of you. And so maybe we could dive into some of those ideas and have some reflection on that. We really appreciate everyone's engagement. Betsy, I know that you've been kind of monitoring the chat as we've been talking. I don't know if there's something that's bubbled up for you in terms of like themes that you could pose to us.
Well, a lot of the chat kind of took care of itself. I think people answered each other's questions. There's a couple of things outstanding. Let me start with the most recent thing that was posted, and I've heard this. I'm sure other people who are on this evening have probably heard this as well. An adoptee, I believe, posted wondering if anyone that was not adopted has ever been asked, aren't you glad you haven't been aborted? And how would you answer? I know as an adoptee, people have said that to me in the past, you know, are you glad you weren't aborted? And it goes along those themes of being grateful, but not only grateful that you landed where you are, but grateful for life, or people assuming that you're pro-life because you're adopted. So it's a loaded comment in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it is, but it's spot on, honestly. And it's funny, the things that are said to adoptees that are not said in response to non-adoptees. Like that thing where you say, aren't you glad you're not aborted? I love that someone has said, well, why wouldn't you ask that person right back the same thing? Well, how about you? You feel good about not being aborted? Like the same choice was available to your mother at the same time as for mine. You're thinking of this from the wrong direction. And it really would be a teachable moment, honestly. But, and I think about how fun it would be to shoot back a response like that. But then what I realized what happened is you turn into the angry adoptee, right? There's like this prison around your thoughts that you can't escape from because everybody's got a perception of how you should feel. And it can enclose your emotions in a way that's super unhealthy. So I appreciate that person bringing up that comment because it would be a phenomenal, quippy, awesome reply. But we do have to be careful not to put ourselves in that angry adoptee position too, because that can backfire. It's all tough.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else added that there's 5 or more threads on Twitter about this, and so if people want to, I haven't seen those, but about adoptees being asked that. So the other thing that was kind of outstanding in the questions was when you were talking about public policy makers, and someone made a comment that it doesn't necessarily help to educate the public policy makers if they can't also educate their constituents. And as you have addressed, people make a connection that pro-adoption must be pro-life. How would you think that they could educate their constituents on some of those issues? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, go ahead, Liz. Were you going to say something?
I think that was
yeah. One of the
sorry.
things
Go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah, that came to mind for me is just, you know, the importance of storytelling and the importance of just sharing our experiences and our stories. I know, you know, one of the things that was going on during the time that I was working in abortion care was, you know, kind of humanizing women who choose abortion. And you know, I think it's something like 50% of women who are seeking an abortion are already parenting at least one child. And so like there's this, and this maybe goes back to what Liz was saying earlier about like, we have this vision of who chooses abortion, who chooses adoption, who chooses to parent. And the truth is they're all the same people at different times in their lives, potentially, right? So I know that's an approach that I've seen in terms of, humanizing the adoption experience, the abortion experience. And I think as we continue to share our stories, we can humanize adoption as well and sort of bring some light to, the nuances and the complexities that, aren't part of normal dialogue.
I would agree. I mean, I think that's part of that entire piece of shaking up the stigmas and the stereotypes. And I mean, I think that the policymakers would need to want to be educated on what it really looks like in the trenches, like rather than from that piece up above of where they're making policies. And I don't know, I think conversations like this are the way to keep doing it, and hope that someone else is going to start listening too, because there's no way to make someone listen who doesn't want to.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like it's continued conversation. Each one of us that touches one other person is going to help change the narrative. And it's kind of all we can do for how deeply entrenched the thoughts of what adoption and abortion actually are in our society.
I think, certainly Adoption Network Cleveland and Betsy, have tons of experience in this realm in terms of opening up adoption records and the very strange alliances and opposition, like, who gets aligned with whom in these various policy discussions. And, depending what the issue is, I don't know, Betsy, if you wanted to add some about that piece of, these camps and how different people align themselves.
Well, I think some of the listeners this evening probably know that through our 25-year process legislatively to open up the records in Ohio, I was very surprised at first to realize that Ohio Right to Life was the main opposition to that proposal for the first 22 years, maybe the 25-year process. And, I was naive and I'm thinking, well, we're already all born already. This isn't really about abortion one way or the other. But of course they were a much more powerful lobby than we were. We were very grassroots at that time and still are. So I think that's a prime example of how they get conflated, or how, certain people's personal opinion maybe can override, how they look at something, and then get a lot of followers to talking about having constituents, believe a certain thing. And so one of the things that we did was follow that very closely in other states, and follow statistics and places where adoptees could get their records, places where adoptees couldn't get their records, and what the statistics really showed. And one of our approaches that was ultimately helped toward our success was to really take on Ohio Right to Life and work on changing the minds of the people in charge of that organization. And I won't get into all the ups and downs and all arounds of that, but it was integral to our success in the end.
Yeah, I can
but
imagine.
I think through that process, the legislators felt like these were all, it led to even more conflation, because that was the dynamic.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
There's a comment here where someone says, as a birth mother, I was always told that my child would be better off without me. I was not in a place to parent, and he would be better off in a home with two parents. So there was that feeling he would be better off without me. This sounds like the marketplace discussion. Forgive me for the analogy, but it feels like there's this classic used car salesman that's trying to convince you, like, hey, you got to make this move, right? This is not the right thing for you. It feels really sort of dirty. It feels like someone is trying to convince this woman that she should be on the production line. Let's move this guy along and on to the next thing. And that is part of the problem. There's a lot of psychology that went into trying to convince mothers that they were not going to be appropriate mothers, and I suspect it still goes on today. And I hate to hear that. And I'm sorry that you dealt with that, because it makes it sound like you're not worthy to be a mother. And that's not true. And I'm sorry that the marketplace drove you in a way that that may have convinced you otherwise, that you could have been a mother to your child. So I'm sorry for that.
I think as we were talking about, preparing for this, we also talked about, sort of the different perspectives or the different driving philosophies that those involved in adoption might have, right? Like, I'll admit, as a prospective adoptive parent, I was interested in knowing, with the adoption agencies that we were working with, like, how often does it happen that, you're working with a woman who's pregnant and she's pursuing an adoption plan, and how often does that actually come to pass and she moves forward with that plan after the baby is born. And I think my perspective on that was like, I want to make sure that you're really working with women during their pregnancies so that they can really, have a really good concept about whether this is the best choice for them. But there is also that market piece, like, right, the more the adoption agencies might feel a pressure to, like, the more babies we place, the more, people will come to us. And, that is a really dangerous place to be in terms of coercion, versus we're working with pregnant people to help them really sort out what's best for them.
Because you know what I heard when you said that? I heard a selling point.
Yes.
That's exactly what it sounded like, a marketing point. And that's not what we're striving for here. It's crazy. So.
And I've seen both sides of that. I think some agencies really pride themselves on the statistics, the number of women that they work with who choose to parent, and having a low statistic of women who choose to place in the end. And I've seen, on the flip side of that, some agencies who almost have a quota system for their workers that, X number of the prospective birth parents that you work with should place. And, it's a real, that's, definitely part of that market force.
Betsy, do you mind going back? There's a question here that I'm kind of interested in the answer to too, because you said it and I was just like, oh, and then so the question here is, why were the anti-abortion people opposed to opening adoption records? Can you just explain that? What were they saying?
That's like a whole nother hour.
Okay, well, now we've got our next.
It's complicated, and
I see.
I'm not sure, even after living it for 25 years, I'm not sure I'm the best person to explain it, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me personally.
I was going to say that basically
But
underscores how stupid it was.
Part of it was the image of the institution of adoption. And again, depending on if you're looking at the 1950s or the 1990s or 2000s, people's perception of adoption and what's good for adoption, and what's good for women that might be considering their choices. So it's very complex. I'd be happy to talk to somebody about it, but we don't have enough time tonight.
Yeah. It sounds like they were taking like a long view that was inappropriate for I got you. Thank you.
It's so interesting. What you just said made me think about, like, all these people trying to decide what's best for women.
Yep.
What types of choices people should have available to.
Yes. Who can,
just because he is able to get their record doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to search, and even if they search, it doesn't necessarily mean that birth parent has to enter into a relationship. I mean, there's a lot of leaps there on that issue too.
Yeah. And
we probably have time for one more question, and I see a number of chats that have come up. So let me see. I don't know if you all looked in the chat and see something that calls to you. One person is recommending a decision tree. I think that's a really interesting point. I'm going to cut and paste this comment, because I think that again is like, you know, another way to frame the discussion. Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think this marketplace has really, there's also been a couple comments about the angry adoptee. So Damon, I think you use that term.
Yeah.
One person was saying, is there also like an angry birth parent or an angry adoptive parent, or is it like the adoptee gets pegged with being angry?
Liz, would you like to step in here?
Yeah. As a birth mother and knowing others too, like there definitely are stereotypes and assumptions of how birth mothers, how much say we can even have after the fact, right? So once we made that decision to choose adoption, do we have the right to really have feelings afterwards? And if we have too many feelings or too many perspectives, then yes, we do have a lot of terms placed on us, including angry or just kind of you're out of your lane type thing. So.
Yeah, it's weird how you can't be allowed to express an impassioned opinion about something and not be labeled as angry and have angry be bad. You know, you might be right. I might be angry and you might be absolutely correct about that. But you have to ask yourself, why am I angry? You know, if that's the case, what am I angry about? Have you looked at this from my side? That, I think, is an important component of the changing of the narrative. Is I'm going to stand here where I was. I think, Betsy, you may have set us up early in the chat and this discussion to say, like, listen, we need to consider each and everyone's perspective. I think, Liz, you hit on that as well. We have to talk to other people and get a variety of opinions. But if you stand where you've always been and formulate an opinion about what I'm saying and perceive me as angry, like, listen, you're wrong, because I'm coming at this from a completely different angle. I have an experience that you haven't had. It doesn't make me angry for me to tell my truth. And that's unfair, because basically I could say everything about your life makes you an angry, you know, adoptive parent, you know, Black man, whatever I could name 100 different things that you're angry about. And I've never lived it from your perspective. So that makes me wrong about your life. So.
Yes.
There's so much we could talk about.
I'm telling you. I'm telling you.
But as with our Monday evenings, we do have the commitment to start on time and to end on time, and it is 9 o'clock, so I'm going to need to cut it off here. But there's so much more to this topic. So Laureen and Damon and Liz, I thank you very much for coming forward and putting yourselves out there and being part of this conversation. Damon, thank you for bringing it up almost a year ago, and Laureen for responding to that, and really, really rich discussion. So thank you.
Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to put in the chat the link to our calendar so that people can see what else we have coming up. To find out more about Adoption Network Cleveland and our work, and to hopefully support our work, you can check out our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. That's part of that link. As many of you know, we're a nonprofit organization that serves individuals and families impacted by adoption and kinship care and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. And we really thank you for being part of this rich discussion this evening. Thanks everybody for joining us, and good night.
Thanks for being here, y'all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.